Hi, I'm Dr. Emma Wells, and join me as I explore this fantastic historical trail, St Cuthbert's Way.
St Cuthbert's Way is a 100-kilometre trail that begins in the Scottish borders and ends at the holy island of Lindisfarne, just off the coast of Northumberland. The route takes in sites significant to the life and death of monk, bishop and hermit St Cuthbert, who was born around 635 AD and whose example and legacy survived long after his death on Innerfarne Island in 687. Afterwards, he became one of the most important medieval saints of England, influencing such figures as Alfred the Great. Cuthbert is regarded as the patron saint of northern England.
Here, at Old Melrose, on the banks of the River Tweed, St Cuthbert began his ministry over 1300 years ago. And this is where we begin our journey. Come on. Together with the chapel, the former abbey site lies on a peninsula formed by a wide eastward bend of the Tweed, cutting into Bemerside Hill. Although the present St Cuthbert's Way route begins at the site of Melrose Abbey 2.5 miles to the west, Cuthbert was actually accepted as a novice here at the Abbey of Old Melrose, or Melrose, by St Boswells in the 7th century. Old Melrose was founded by King Oswald and St Aidan, the first Bishop of Lindisfarne, along with monks from the island of Iona in 635 AD. However, the abbey was destroyed in 839 AD on the order of Kenneth MacAlpin, King of the Scots. In 1080, a chapel of Durham Cathedral was built on the site of the former abbey, on what is now known as Chapel Knowe, and dedicated to their most notable saint, Cuthbert. This site was a place of pilgrimage until the Reformation in the 16th century, when both the site and chapel were left in ruins. The monastic community then chose to re-site their new abbey at the current location of Melrose Abbey. During the Viking raids, when Cuthbert's body was wandered around this landscape, it was also buried here for protection. Can you provide a sort of brief overview of St Cuthbert and his life?
Well, St Cuthbert, I wrote a book about the saints, and of all of the saints, Cuthbert for me is the one that reconciles the disparate aspects of what it meant to be an Anglo-saxon saint most completely, because he has an early life, possibly as a warrior, possibly, certainly in the secular world, he's probably from a noble family. And from this life, he then enters a Celtic monastic environment, which is different to the sort of Benedictine rules that we see rolled out on the continent. But he develops within this context. And then he goes to Lindisfarne, at a point really that Lindisfarne is having to redefine itself, having to set itself up as a place where Roman and Celtic ideas can be merged together. Mm-hmm. And what we hear about Cuthbert, we don't get it from him, we get it from the people that write about him, that write about his life, and the artworks that survive associated with him, which is all very carefully coordinated in order to present him in a certain way. What we learn is that he is this wonderful kind of point of reconciliation. He is all things to all men. He's the perfect saint, the perfect monk, the perfect bishop. Of course, that isn't possible as a living, breathing individual, but that's the impression we get from him through down the ages. And actually, the stories you do read about him, there's a lot of stories associated with him in nature, lovely stories about him talking to the ravens and talking to the otters, and those things kind of humanise him in a way, but we always have to be a bit careful that we are getting a second-hand account of who he is.
The medieval church here at Maxton was first recorded as St Cuthbert's Church of Maxton, afterwards Maxiston, some 500 years after the saint's era.
But was very likely served by the monastic community of Old Melrose. Maxton was certainly linked to the later Melrose Abbey, as the landowner allowed the monks to utilise its land for pasture and quarrying. Not only is the church therefore dedicated to the saint, but until the 1960s, a well of St Cuthbert was sited at the west end of the village, although now it is completely untraceable due to later road improvements. The present building has lost its medieval character due to extensive enlargements and successive restorations throughout the centuries. The only medieval feature to survive is this beautiful western entrance on the south side with the round-headed doorway and its moulded archivolt. Located on the banks of the River Tweed, here within the grounds of Benrig Cemetery, are the ruins of Old St Boswells. The original village of St Boswells stood over at Benrig, on the area between the current riverbank and higher ground. As the site was prone to flooding, the villagers eventually moved to higher ground at Lessudon, the place of Aidan, and the present site of the village. The Church of St Mary here was established in the 12th century, during the reign of David I. Over time, the worshippers moved to the old kirk, erected at Benrig. The old kirk here was built in 1652 to replace the church at Lessudon, which was subsequently demolished in the mid-20th century. To the east of these ruins also stood the chapel of St Boisel, the 7th century prior of Melrose and Cuthbert's mentor. St Boisel is known to have made use of local springs and wells for healing power, and no doubt medieval pilgrims followed in his footsteps. The most interesting of these are the Crystal Well and Mule Gang, which are listed structures adjacent to the way. They represent the mid-18th century landscape design so prevalent across Britain, where utilitarian structures were combined to create more picturesque and natural vistas. The current structure here at the Crystal Well is a later folly, a grotto in fact, built in the mid-19th century by the Elliots of Benrig House. Above is another interesting structure. The height of modern technology at its time, the Mule Gang comprises a rusticated stone arch set in the bank with a hydraulic ram and circular gin house. This allowed for a donkey to walk in a circular motion to pump water up to the house from the well below.
There was quite clear guidelines within Anglo-Saxon England of how you developed a cult of saints. Saints were big business. They meant masses of income, tourism, investment, and relics were changing hands as you know, for the equivalent of fine artworks. They were big business. But when it came to Anglo-Saxon cults of saints, you've got these different groups, particularly in the north of England, who are all slightly different. They're all offering alternative setups. So over at Jarrow and Monkwearmouth, you've got a hotbed of scholarship, of scriptorial activity, more Roman than Rome, with its glass windows and its stone buildings and its massive Bibles. Over at Hexham and Ripon, you've got Wilfrid, and he is modelling himself much more on the all-powerful bishop monks of Gaul. So he has empurpled manuscripts, he has caskets that replicate ivory caskets. That's his setup. Lindisfarne develops its own brand, its own unique approach to the cult of Cuthbert, which is deliberately blending Celtic art, Celtic ideas with Roman influences, very self-consciously. So as an art historian, I can look at it and say, right, those swirls and spirals are Celtic. That Germanic patternwork there is Anglo-Saxon, that's Roman. But they are doing that deliberately. It's like graphic design, they're cultivating it to show that the saint himself, but also the community, is bringing all these ideas together.
Here, St Cuthbert's Way cuts through Yeavering Bell. This is the largest Iron Age hill fort in Northumberland, dominating the North Cheviot hill fort of the National Park. Covering over 13 acres, it featured an important Iron Age royal settlement with stone ramparts 10 feet thick and inside around 125 huts. The large ditched enclosure around the bell's eastern summit is later than the hut platforms that surround it. The hill fort is usually thought to date from the latter half of the first millennium BC, although it could be earlier, such as the late Bronze Age. The word Yeavering comes from the Brittonic words Gaffer and Bryn, meaning goat hill, as around this area are many feral goats. At the foot of Yeavering Bell, you can see the Gefrin Memorial, an 8-foot stone wall behind which the royal palace is said to have stood. Here we are at Ad Gefrin, the site of King Edwin's 7th century royal palace. Nothing survives of the palace except a monument and an empty field. One of the most famous archaeological sites in early medieval Britain, it was excavated by world-renowned archaeologist Brian Hope Taylor in the 1960s. They revealed evidence from a settlement from the period of Christian conversion from the 6th to the 7th century. The way then passes through St Cuthbert's Cave Wood towards the cave itself, perhaps one of the most evocative sights of the entire route. Known locally as Cuddy's Cove, Cuddy being an affectionate term for Cuthbert, it is said to be one of the places where Cuthbert tended his sheep as a child. A clear path leads down to the large natural sandstone outcrop located within the dense wood. The outcrop is supported by a pillar, while an area in front is contained within an enclosure formed by an earthen bank. This may relate to its later use as a 19th century lambing pen. It's also believed that Cuthbert lived here as a hermit in between spells on the islands of Innerfarne and Lindisfarne. While the monks of Lindisfarne also stopped on their journey when fleeing the invading Danes, burying the exhumed body of Cuthbert in the 9th century. Lindisfarne, or Holy Island as it is known, is claimed to be the holiest place in all of England, and it is certainly one of the most famous Christian sites in Western Europe. From here, we arrive at perhaps the most spiritual and evocative part of the journey, where we can literally trace the steps of pilgrims past from the causeway route to Holy Island. This is known as the Pilgrim's Path, as it has been the route followed by wayfarers and travellers to the island since Cuthbert's death. It is marked the entire way by a line of timber poles from the mainland to the entrance to Lindisfarne village. Lindisfarne is intimately connected with the history of Christianity in Britain. The Northumbrian king Oswald summoned an Irish monk named Aidan from Iona, the island monastery of the southwest coast of what is now Scotland, to be bishop of his kingdom. Oswald granted Aidan and his companions the small tidal island of Lindisfarne, on which to found a monastery. Indeed, Aidan established his monastery here in 635 AD, and the Christian message was established and sent out into the pagan north. This is furthered by the fact that the gloriously stunning illuminated Lindisfarne Gospels were created here around the turn of the 8th century by Edfrith, Bishop of Lindisfarne. According to an inscription added in the 10th century at the end of the original text, the manuscript was made in honour of God and of St. Cuthbert. The Lindisfarne Gospels, and others like it, helped define the growing sense of Englishness, a spirit consolidated by the Venerable Bede, the historian monk, in his The Ecclesiastical History of the English People, completed in 731 AD. Today, visitors flock to the current 12th century Lindisfarne Priory to see the original resting place of St. Cuthbert, built on the site of the 7th century church where his tomb once stood. However, following the Viking raids in the 9th century, the monks of Lindisfarne decided to flee. They took with them their most precious possessions, including the relics of St. Cuthbert and the Lindisfarne Gospels. They wandered first for a full 7 years, when they were given a church at Chesterley Street near Durham. In the late 10th century, another Danish invasion threatened, so the body of Cuthbert was moved again, this time to Ripon in North Yorkshire, for a few months before Cuthbert was once more carted off. The intention was to return to Chesterley Street, but on the way the bones lay at Durham, where apparently signs were shown indicating that it was the place the saint wished to be buried. Located some 600 feet southwest of Lindisfarne, this small cell was also used by Egbert, Cuthbert's successor. Identified now by a small wooden cross, the island's surviving remains include a T-shaped chapel consisting of a room divided into 2 compartments, creating a possible cell and oratory, and a northwest circular mound associated with Cuthbert's original circular cell. The chapel foundations appear to be primarily medieval in date, not contemporary to Cuthbert's lifetime, but it is likely they were rebuilt for the purposes of medieval pilgrimage, as a tourist attraction for pilgrims to visit and observe where the saint had lived and worshipped, which is still the case to this very day.
The archaeology that's coming out of the ground at the moment about the Anglo-saxon community at Lindisfarne is really exciting, and it shows that where we do have that later medieval building, the community itself was very nearby, and actually that site was the site of Cuthbert and Aidan's community. So there is continuity, and with anything Anglo-Saxon, it's very hard to reconstruct the space realistically in a genuine way, because they built in timber predominantly. You know, why are they on headlands? Why are they on tidal islands? There's a choice, and they're chosen because they're beautiful, spiritual, special places.
Situated to the priory's rear is a grassy mound known as the Hough, upon which are these rectangular foundations thought to be a former watchtower. In his account of Cuthbert's death, the Venerable Bede mentions a similar structure from which the monks of Lindisfarne learned of news of Cuthbert's death across the sea on Inner Farne. When the news came, those attending him lit 2 torches as a prearranged signal of his passing. A vivid view of Farne can be obtained from the watchtower here, raising the possibility that this is the same building recounted by Bede. The structure is also known as the Chapel of the Lamp, and is thought to be the site of an early form of lighthouse dating from the 14th century, originally operated by the priors. But the story of Cuthbert does not end there. Following his death on Inner Farne Island in 687 AD, his body was buried in Lindisfarne Priory, where his tomb quickly became a magnet for pilgrims, as miracles were reported at his grave. In fact, so numerous were they that Cuthbert was called the Wonder Worker of England. Journeys end for me, and I am reminded of the words of Abraham Cowley. Curiosity does, No less than devotion pilgrims make.